I'd like to start by welcoming Claire Forrest to the DLD project. Claire, I might get you to start by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your paper.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks so much for having me on the vlog. I'm Claire Forrest. I'm currently working as a postdoc at the UCL Institute of Education, University of London. I'm about to restart a project on early language interventions, but my PhD was on developmental language disorder, looking at the social and emotional outcomes in adolescents. And I did it with Michelle St. Clair at the University of Bath, who I know you've had on the vlog before.
Mm-hmm.
And so specifically, I was looking at the mechanisms that are involved in this relationship between DLD and increased social and emotional difficulties. And the paper I'm going to talk about today was one of the studies that we did. So it's written with Michelle and Jenny Gibson at the University of Cambridge. And what we wanted to do was look at whether social functioning could mediate or explain some of the emotional outcomes that these adolescents experience. So we termed this the social mediation hypothesis, because we know that this exists in the general population, so children and adolescents who have experienced victimization or peer difficulties, they're more likely to experience sadness, loneliness, depression. So we wanted to see if the same relationship existed in the DLD population. And so to do this, we had a group of 26 adolescents with DLD and 27 typically language developed adolescents. We gave questionnaires to their parents and we gave questionnaires to the adolescents as well. So the parents filled in the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, which is quite common in the literature, looking at the social, emotional and behavioral functioning of children. And then the adolescents themselves, we gave them questionnaires about the anxiety, depression, general mental well-being as well. We also looked at their social relationships and if they felt they had social support from their friends. And we also asked them some questions to get a bit more detail. So things like, do you have a best friend? How often do you argue with your friends? Have you ever been bullied? And things like that. So we wanted to try and get a fuller picture of the social functioning that these adolescents experience. And so we compared the two groups and we were expecting to see that there would be a difference. We thought the DLD group would have increased rates of social and emotional problems. And we thought that the social problems would explain some of these emotional problems as we see in the general population.
I think that your topic, Claire, is incredibly relevant for so many people who do listen into the vlog and engage with the DLD project, because one of the things that comes up all the time is around that social emotional well-being. So I'd love if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your key findings from this study with our listeners.
Yeah, so we did find what we expected on the one hand. So the parents of the DLD group did rate their children as experiencing more social problems, so more peer problems and more emotional difficulties, so significantly higher than the typical language group. However, surprisingly, we found that the adolescents themselves didn't report the same things. So the DLD group thought that they had the similar amounts of social problems and emotional problems, so there was no significant difference there. The typical language group actually did report arguing with their friends more than the DLD group. So that's a bit surprising because we thought there'd be more peer problems in the DLD group, but maybe that points to the fact that their communication skills might hinder them a bit in navigating these tricky situations and being able to navigate conflict resolution. So they might not have those skills, and so they might not argue as much with their friends as the typical language group does. I mean, not surprisingly, they did say the DLD group didn't attend as many social groups, so maybe again that's because of a barrier of their language skills. They don't attend as many of these groups, and so maybe they're not experiencing as many social situations. So maybe that's another reason, is that they don't have as many social situations to compare to. So when they're rating themselves and saying, you know, I have good social support for my friends and I have problems or victimization, they didn't seem to acknowledge that as in the way that we expected that they would. I mean, they did have slightly higher rates of victimization. So they were bullied a little bit more frequently, but it wasn't significantly different than the typical group. So yeah, we found that super interesting, and we thought, you know, is that something to do with how they're perceiving the situations? So then when we wanted to test the social mediation hypothesis, we took the parent rating. So we plugged in the peer report, so the peer problems, and looked at that relationship and how it explained the emotional problems. And we found that it explained approximately 69% of that relationship. So it kind of suggests that children or adolescents who have social problems are perhaps more likely to have emotional problems. And that's the reasoning behind it. And when we looked at it again, we put it in the other way. So we wanted to see whether emotional problems were having an effect on social problems. That only accounted for about 30% of the relationship. So it definitely points that there is this direction, as expected, that social problems have these negative emotional outcomes. And so, yeah, we found that interesting, and we hope that there's going to be more research on that, because it was quite a small sample that we did, and it's only one study.
I think absolutely fascinating work. I really like the fact that I guess you're looking at that duality in the interrelationship and not, you're not, as you said, leaping to massive conclusions just yet. But I think it's really promising to see that there might be some areas for further investigation. I think that, as I said earlier, we've got a number of, clinicians and families who listen in and benefit from, accessing wonderful researchers like yourself. What would be some of your key messages that you'd like to share with clinicians and families in particular?
So I think there's three main areas to consider. So the first one being that we replicated the findings that there are these increased social and emotional difficulties in adolescents with DLD. So that's something for parents and clinicians to be aware of when working and trying to support their young people, that they might have these added difficulties. So it's not just the communication skills, but they have these additional social and emotional difficulties as well. I think the fact that we tested this social mediation hypothesis and we saw the direction is quite encouraging, and that so social difficulties could be an area to target for interventions to try and alleviate these emotional difficulties. And I'm encouraged to see that the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, they've actually included that in their top 10 research priorities that they released in 2019. They want to see more interventions, excuse me, they want to see more interventions looking at the wider social and emotional well-being of adolescents with DLD. So that's something to consider as well. Thirdly, the fact that the adolescents didn't report the findings that we expected them to. Does this actually point to something that they have a difficulty with understanding their own social emotions, social awareness skills? That's again something clinicians could look at working on them with. Or is it the fact that maybe they don't have the adequate words to express these feelings? So again, more work perhaps on naming emotions, naming feelings, and navigate, and and the skills how to navigate social situations.
Just wrapping up, Claire, I'm just wondering, is there anything else, just as we're finishing, that you'd like to add?
I think just to remember that this was a small sample and it is preliminary findings. So as we said, more research is definitely needed. And I think for parents as well, a lot of the time when I talk about these things, I seem to always focus on the negatives. And I want to just reassure parents that, it's not necessarily true that your children are going to have all these difficulties and struggle. It's just, I think, good to be aware that they are at slightly more increased risk of experiencing social and emotional problems. And perhaps also just a little plug as well is that we have other studies. We have looked at the the other avenues, and one of them is the social cognition skills. And so hopefully there's a paper coming out soon about that, so keep a lookout.
Watch
and it's
this
looking
space.
at whether they're able to understand the social situations, and if that is having an effect on these results that we found in this paper.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Claire, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing more about your research soon.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing what the DLD project comes up with next.